Hi, Sandy O'Sullivan again. I'm here to talk about film and screen representation this week. Well, I'm going to break it up into 3 videos, and so hopefully you won't have too much trouble following and piecing them together. But I've tried to break it up into the first one, which talks about some early representations in film, and in particular focused around Jeddah. So I'll start with that. The next 2 are going to look at some more recent representations. What separates, I guess, this video from the other 2 is that this is really about non-Indigenous people telling the story and the stories of Aboriginal people, well or not so well. So Jeddah is a pretty problematic film. Many of you will have seen it by now. It was originally called Jeddah the Uncivilized, and the narrative really was, it was quite problematic in a lot of ways. Even at the time there was some criticism of it, but it was also a very unusual thing at the time to see Aboriginal people on screen playing leading roles. Robert Tudawali and Rosalie Kunoth-Monks in the two of the main roles represented in Jeddah. And there's an interesting set of moments that are created in this space. And it's some of those moments that I want to talk about, not just in relation to this film, but also looking at 3 other films as a part of this trajectory. So Jeddah the Uncivilized, I won't go back over the idea of how the character is formed, but effectively, she becomes representative both at the time and much later of stolen generations. She's taken from her family and brought into a white family. She lives with station owners, and she's brought up as their daughter. And it's pretty clear early on that she's a replacement daughter for a child that died. So her character is pretty complex, obviously clever, given a lot of attention by her adoptive mother, but there is this undertone that we keep seeing all the way through that she's not quite white. And it's not to do with the colour of her skin, it's to do with something else that's happening. And so it's this idea that the native, in great big inverted commas, can't be altered and changed in our very nature. And so there are some incredibly problematic things, but as we can see, the poster for it has the magic of the native mating call was stronger than the habits of civilization. And that's pretty much the Cliff Notes on it. So speaking of Cliff Notes, there's a couple of sets of notes that are really interesting and really worth looking at. They're both of them on the National Film and Sound Archive website. You'll find these for a lot of films that have a focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and I really urge you to look at them. There's what's called Curators Notes and then additional notes. The additional notes, particularly up to about 7 or 8 years ago, were written by Romaine Morton, who is a remarkable scholar, fantastic filmmaker and storyteller, and her work has been quite, she's produced quite a substantial body of work herself. But part of what she did was that she went back through as an Aboriginal scholar and looked at all of these films and actually created an alternative narrative around the summaries and the synopsis that's really worth a read to see them side by side. And so I've put both of them into the PowerPoint so that you can see that, but you can just go to the National Film and Sound Archives links and you can see it across a lot of films that she's done this with. So we've got a really interesting thing, a scene that's set between Sarah, the adoptive mother, Jeddah, who is this incredible force throughout the film, played by Rosalie Kunoth-Monks, and then Marbuk, who is framed as a traditional and sort of remarkable traditional man who comes on the scene is unlike anybody that Jeddah has ever seen. So he's framed as traditional, but he's also kind of a traditional bad boy. He's played by Robert Tidawali. So we've got these characters that are incredibly important characters who are then manipulated into particular actions through the story. And we see a moment that is really fascinating as the moment of understanding that Jeddah can't live in both worlds. It's this notion of both worlds. It's this incredibly problematic 20th century notion that Aboriginal people couldn't live in both worlds, when in fact we were doing exactly that. And so there's a really interesting problem that's attached to that as well. And that's that we see time and again with Jeddah and her mother, this idea that she should be doing all these things that a young white woman is doing, but she wants to explore this other side of her and she wants to understand her own existence. And one of the ways that we see that represented is when she's playing the piano, where there's suddenly, in great big inverted commas, jungle rhythms. It's an incredibly problematic moment in the film. But it's also that moment where there's a break, this idea that she just can't take it anymore and she needs to think of what exists beyond the trappings that she's been put into. And so then what we see at the end is this remarkable moment where, and I'm just showing it on the screen at the moment, where we see the idea that sacrifice, going over the cliff, this idea of a willingness to do anything to be traditional is there as an idea, as a moment. But it's also there as this idea of people sacrificing, and unfortunately we mean Aboriginal people sacrifice. It's this whole notion of the primitive. And it's incredibly problematic. I put it next to, as you can see in this shot, Birth of a Nation. There's an interesting, really similar shot that happens as at a crucial moment in Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation's got like about 10 different crucial moments, so it's not the only one. But it is the moment when the Ku Klux Klan is developed, because Birth of a Nation is a film about the Ku Klux Klan and the formation of it. It's about celebrating that. So this is a film that talks about the willingness to throw yourself off a cliff because a black man is going to attack you, maybe. Maybe not, because actually that isn't really what's happening in Birth of a Nation either. So there's this idea of the horror that's being challenged and played through. And interestingly, it's the same thing. It's a cliff. It's this idea of the throwing yourself off. It's not Romeo and Juliet. It's something else. And it's the something else that's pretty problematic about it. So flash forward to another film that has a resonance with it. And it's Night Cries. Now, Night Cries is a response, absolutely a response to Jeddah. It's made in 1989, so a generation later than Jeddah, and it's made by an Aboriginal filmmaker. When Night Cries came out, this wasn't a film that was released widely. It's a short film that was largely made for gallery audiences, and it's an amazing film that's about the complexity of stolen generations at a time when a lot of people didn't know what that meant at all. And so this was an explanation of it, but it was Jeddah grown up. It was this idea of what would happen in terms of, if you haven't seen Night Cries yet, it's a very complex story that has almost no dialogue, and it's a complex story that's about the relationship between a middle-aged Aboriginal woman and her very elderly adoptive white mother, and she's caring for her mother, and it's about the resentments and the relationship and the love, and it's incredibly complex. And as you can see even from this still, the backdrop is a remarkable backdrop that that actually shows again a kind of rarefied light and colour and shape of the landscape. It's using some beautiful desert motifs, and it's doing it in the context of a stage. It's very much the broad strokes, and it's an amazing tribute to that earlier piece. But it also absolutely challenges it, and it turns the discussion around where the motivations are around, and control in some instances is around the central figure of the daughter, who is controlling her emotions constantly throughout it, but she's also telling her story in this space. And I'd argue that it's because it's Moffat making it, and that it's this opportunity finally to tell that complex story. There's an interesting, I don't want to say throwback, but it's a moment where this gets challenged again. And I want to bring you back to Rosalie Kunoth-Monks, who plays Jeddah, was on Q&A a few years ago. And she did a remarkable speech. I'll be putting up a link to the speech, where she talks about not being the problem, Aboriginal people not being the problem. And, it's incredibly powerful. This is someone who's been an educator her whole life. This is someone who has had agency and been incredibly strong in the formation of her community and in leadership within her community. And, she's a remarkable orator. So part of what she's done is challenged a whole lot of these ideas of who she was in the past, but also recognise the power of that. And, this is I guess, a full circle discussion. And I think one of the interesting things then around not just the way that Kunoth-Monks talks about this, but also the way that she talks about her relationship back to Jeddah. She felt disconnected, being brought into the city where the film was shot, being taken away from her own community. Even though she certainly had choice over it, she didn't really feel like she had choice over it. And it transformed her world, and it took her a long time to go back to where she was before, both literally and figuratively. And she's talked about that in a range of different articles, which I'll put up. Kunoth-Monks she was actually the chancellor of the previous institution that I worked at, and she's really an incredibly remarkable person. But what was really interesting was to fast forward 40 years from Jeddah, when a film called, again made by a white filmmaker and a white writer in terms of the recasting of it and the reshaping of the story, Rabbit Proof Fence. So Rabbit Proof Fence, again, when it went through a process of casting and getting lead actors to play the kids, there was some resonances with the process of Jeddah. In fact, that the children in the film, now adult, have seen as deeply problematic, and that's really interesting and also really problematic. But again, a lot of this is the fantasy and the idea and the ideology of the people who are making the film. So while Rabbit Proof Fence is a really, really complex and interesting film, and obviously based on a story written by Aboriginal people, it also has this problematic legacy, a more recent legacy. So again, I'll post a link to an interview with two of the actors. So I'd love you to take some time to think about the relationship between these four films and to think about how, as films, they contribute to our understanding. I mean, in the case of Birth of a Nation, it contributes to, well, who knows what it contributes to, a lot of things, but certainly an understanding of the fear of black people. That was part of its intention by the filmmaker. But the other three films in particular, I think, are incredibly interesting to our narratives here, in thinking about who writes the story, who tells the story, who were they telling it for, who was the audience, who was the intended audience. Was this meant to go to an international audience? What did international people think? In fact, if you read Morton's Curators Notes, you'll read a little bit about that. So, and when you read her notes, you'll read something really crucial. You'll read the way that she talks about the people compared to the way that the original Curators Notes did. The people who were involved in it, particularly the black actors that were involved with it, is quite different. So worth a read. So I'll leave it at that for this section, and in the next one we're going to move on to films that are actually made by Aboriginal people. Lovely. Thanks.